What a fantastic idea IEL is.
I'm very impressed by the core areas of the conference. I mean, it really is a kind of mouth-watering menu that we have in front of us.
I think one of the things that I've enjoyed at this conference is going to hear the kinds of papers that very often when I go to the LSA, I often don't hear.
For me, this has been, to a certain extent, sort of Sarah walks down memory lane here.
And we're making history in a much bigger splash than I think anybody anticipated, which has produced a great deal more work for the organizers than they ever imagined.
Und ich danke auch alle Mitarbeiter für die exzellente Organisation dieser Tagung.
Remember this first IEL conference as one of utmost academic enrichment and personal well-being.
A truly great conference.
IEL, it seems to me, is a perfect place to provide some order, but not, I suspect, any end.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. May I have your attention, please, for a word of welcome. For a word of welcome from Professor Heiner Schanz, Prorektor of Albert-Ludwigs-Universität Freiburg and Professor of Forest and Environmental Policy. Prorektor Schanz.
Dear delegates, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, when our rector was invited to contribute a word of welcome to the conference brochure, which by now you are probably all holding in your hands, he introduced you to the history of English studies in our university, pointing out how it grew from humble beginnings to its present state. In English, as in many other subjects in the humanities, this university is thus able to build on a strong foundation. Let me expand on our rector's welcome note by pointing out at least one of several historical links between Freiburg and renowned scholars in English studies, as is fitting in the presence of such an august meeting of international experts in your field. All of you are familiar with James Murray, the moving spirit and founding editor of the New English Dictionary on Historical Principles, later to become known as the Oxford English Dictionary, or OED. But I trust that not many in the audience will be aware that among the several honorary degrees James Murray was awarded in the course of a long and illustrious academic career, there's a doctorate from Freiburg University, conferred in 1896 on, and I quote the Latin, Viro Doctissimo Jacobo Murray Oxoniensi, for, and here I translate the Latin of the citation, scrutinizing the history of the Scottish and English tongues in a most subtle and acute way. What moved the Freiburg promoters to list the Scottish tongue before the English cannot be gleaned from the sources. What the sources of the time are not silent on, however, is Murray's response to the trip to the nearby Kaiserstuhl wine-growing region, which was laid on by his local hosts as a sequel of the formal pomp of the degree awarding ceremony. The teetotaling Scot refused to compromise his principles and stuck to plain table water for an entire afternoon and evening. I'm sure that a look at the records stored in our university archives would bring to light evidence of numerous further instances of international academic exchange of all kinds since those days. But in the interest of the smooth running of this conference, I shall forego the temptation to dig deeper in a great past and return to present concerns. As a member of the management board of our university, I assure you that we intend to preserve our impressive heritage in the humanities for the future. It is imperative, in my view, that alongside bioscience and material science, and you probably have heard about the Nobel Prize only yesterday and where it has been carried out, the research, namely here in Freiburg. Alongside bioscience and material science, two other areas in which Freiburg happens to be strong, the humanities retain their place as a part of the Universitas Literarum also in the 21st century. This is possible if we ensure that research in the humanities is not just visible locally. Valuable, though, such cross-fertilization between the university and the community might be, but it must be visible internationally. You are gathering, bringing together, as I'm told, almost 300 academics from more than 30 nations in all continents is precisely the type of event which is needed to bring this about. I'm thus happy to officially open this inaugural meeting of the International Society for the Linguistics of English and wish you an intellectually stimulating and socially pleasant meeting during which you may also be able to take the occasional time off to explore the rich historical heritage and scenic beauty of Freiburg and its surroundings. And if you should feel so inclined, partake even those pleasures which the eminent Dr. Murray steered clear of. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Prorektor Schanz, for making time in a no doubt very busy schedule to open this inaugural meeting. I actually took you at your word and dug deeper in the rich historical archives of the University of Freiburg and unearthed a few more links between the history of English studies and the history of Freiburg University. In fact, at about the time that James Murray received his honorary degree, the lector in charge of teaching our students English was one Ernest Weekly, a young man then who was later to become Professor of Modern Languages at Nottingham in England. As some of you no doubt know, he contributed publications such as The Romance of Words, published for the first time in 1912, a concise etymological dictionary of modern English, which some of us occasionally may even have a look at today. Then, continuing with Words Ancient and Modern in 1926, very popular book at the time, obviously followed by a sequel, More Words, Ancient and Modern, and then finally culminating in 1932 in Words and Names. But what is the poor lector Ernest Weekly really known for? For the sad fact that in 1912, novelist D.H. Lawrence eloped with his wife, Frieda von Richthofen, whom he had got to know in Freiburg, and they got married, and the rest is history, as they say. I came across a very early high-profile American link in our annals. It bears the name of Mellon, yes, actually one of the Mellons of Carnegie Mellon fame. In 1934, Matthew T. Mellon, another English lector, successfully defended his PhD on early American views on Negro slavery from the time of the founding of the Republic until 1830. Now, I find it very ironical and moving that in the early years of the dark era of National Socialism, a classic in African American studies should have been published in Freiburg, probably escaping the censors. A few years later, still in this dark era, one of the great pioneers of linguistics in America, Charles Carpenter Freese, actually spent an entire academic year, 1938, 1939, in Freiburg with his whole family. Actually, his intention was to spend the year in Prague, but through some complications, he ended up in Freiburg. Many years later, one of his sons told me about the difficult time the Freese family had making their passage back to the United States in September 1939 for various world historical reasons. And finally, an event which I was able to witness personally in much calmer times in 1993, another honorary degree was conferred on Kenneth Lee Pike, famous American linguist. But enough of history. As you can imagine, we had a sometimes trying time organizing this conference. We gave some of you a trying time, for which I obviously apologize. And on the way to the opening, you can't help wondering sometimes about why are we doing this? Why am I doing this to my team, to my secretary, and so on? But now that I look at you, expectant audience, famous scholars in the field, people who will be famous one day, I can say your presence, don't laugh, it happens. I mean, think about all the big names. I mean, they started out young. They weren't born famous. As I said, I mean, looking at you, at this expectant audience, makes you forget all the troubles, and I know it's all been worth it. So, the English department of the University of Freiburg, my co-organizer Bernd Kortmann, the whole IEL organizing committee, too numerous to mention, you've seen them swarming around in the corridors, are looking forward to what we hope will turn out to be a truly great conference. I would like to thank everybody for the great work they have already done. I would like to thank you, the participants, for coming here, and I wish all of you and all of us an interesting and pleasant time here in Freiburg. So thank you very much from me. Bernd Kortmann will now take over and smoothly lead over into our first plenary. Bernd.
Yeah, the stress is on smoothly. So first of all, good morning to all of you. So it's an enormous pleasure for me too to welcome all of you here in Freiburg as the co-host of this conference. When thinking of what to say on this occasion, I couldn't help but recall the, in my opinion, ingenious motto of the 2006 Football World Cup here in Germany, Die Welt zu Gast bei Freunden, literally something like the world visiting friends. I think at the time the original, the translation in English was something like a time to make friends, but this doesn't render at all, I think, the original German motto. But Die Welt zu Gast bei Freunden, the world visiting friends, this I believe is still a wonderful motto for an international conference like this one. It has several times been said, more than 300 participants from some 30 nations. It's only that in this case, I think we are at least one step ahead of this motto. Because for Christian and me, the implicit personal motto of IL1 has been all along friends visiting friends, or simply friends visiting. We have friends visiting from all over the world, and I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying that never before have I attended a conference with so many dear colleagues, true friends, and highly respected, internationally acclaimed people I've always wanted to meet. And my guess is that there may be quite a few more in this lecture hall this morning who share this feeling, which simply shows that it was a great idea and high time indeed for launching this society. As you can imagine, when you organize a conference in the spirit of its friends visiting, this is at the same time an enormous challenge, obligation, but also an enormous incentive. And what we, the whole organizational team, hope is to have created and to continue to create an atmosphere that shows you just how welcome all of you are, and that you will remember this first IEL conference as one of utmost academic enrichment and personal well-being.
Good evening, everybody. It's a delight to be here, and what a fantastic idea IEL is, and long may it continue. This morning, the tone of the day was set very firmly. As I sat with breakfast in the Victoria Hotel, the Beatles were playing, and they were playing All You Need Is Love. And that's the point. That's all any of us need. That's what linguists need in general, and that's what English linguists need especially. We need to be loved. We try to be lovable. And we need this more than other branches of linguistics, I suspect, because we are hated so much. We have spent the day, some of us, on normative linguistics, and we have been talking about the battalions of people out there who hate us simply because we try to say that things are as they are. So it can get to you at times, you know, and one needs to find groups of people who find you lovable. And the best way of finding these groups of people, it seems to me, is to go into applied linguistics. Because applied linguistics is the lovability of linguistics, as far as I am concerned. Applied English linguistics, therefore, it seems to me, is the best way of guaranteeing certain quantums of love for all of us here. Hence, although IEL in its conference is predominantly, it seems to me, on general English linguistics, sort of pure English linguistics, if you like, this evening I thought I would adopt a different perspective and talk about some of the applications that are ongoing in this area. It is a never-ending saga, it seems to me, applied linguistics and applied English linguistics. I always thought I knew what applied linguistics was. I remember being around when organizations like BAL were being formed and people were discussing the different kinds of categories that were going to be in the subject. And then as you went to applied linguistics conference after applied linguistics conference over the years, you got a bit blasé about it because every conference would have a section on stylistics and a section on English language teaching and a section on educational stuff, a section on speech pathology in later years, a section on forensic, a section on interpreting, a section on translating, and so on. And you know, you got used to it. It was a very familiar world. You knew where you were. And after a while, I thought, that's it. You know, applied linguistics has defined itself. We have a domain. It has its categories. They're recognized. They're even given Roman numerals in some organizations. And there we go. And until very recently, I honestly did think that applied linguistics had reached its limits. But not anymore. Because now I find all sorts of areas that I had not expected to exist, and certainly had never expected myself to feel the demand to contribute to. And I have 3 of them for you this evening. Each of them I'm currently working in some shape or form, but each of them requires huge numbers of people to work in if they are going to develop into a comparable level of the earlier domains of applied linguistics. I'm going to talk firstly about what I'm calling applied English historical linguistics, and then secondly, about applied English museological linguistics, whatever that is, and then thirdly, applied English internet linguistics. The handout that is sort of around is simply a handout of the references that I shall be making as I go through this talk. And if there are not enough, you can email me later and I'll send you a copy through the ether. So the first, applied English I had never expected to apply historical linguistics. Did you apply historical linguistics? My entire life, since being an undergraduate in those Jeff Long days, has been a love-hate affair with historical linguistics, and with sound changes in particular. It started when I studied Old English, as I guess most of you did, and you had a sneaking suspicion that this language might have been spoken once. And so you went to your tutor and asked him, Are we all right here? Yeah, okay. I don't know what you did, but it was quite exciting. You would go to your tutor and ask him the question that I asked my tutor. Having encountered the Old English word for king, which was spelled C-Y-N-I-N-G, I went up to him and said, "How do you pronounce this?" And his reply was, "Well, we don't exactly know. It is, of course, a high front vowel, possibly rounded a little, and it derives from... Yes, but how does it sound? Can you pronounce it for me?" "No, I wouldn't like to do that, because that would suggest a value which we're uncertain about, because historical phonology is in an uncertain... Yes, but I just want to hear it just once." And he wouldn't do it, you see. He wouldn't do it. Eventually, I got out of him. It was something like Künning. I thought, oh, thank you, God, that's all I wanted to know. And whether that was exactly right or slightly not right didn't matter to me. The point was I had a word I could say. Beowulf now became something that plausibly you could read aloud and hear the effects of. And then somebody told me, of course, that that's how it was originally. But would you ever know by looking at the sound change studies that have been done on Beowulf and the rest? No, you would not. So as a result, I got very interested in sound changes as an end in themselves, but always from the point of view of how they would actually produce in practice, in performance, if you like. And I was glad to see, when I carried on my studies, that there were others around who shared the same view. A.C. Gimson, who taught me a great deal of phonetics, was very much of the same mind. And so but I never thought that this concept of turning historical phonology into practice, into performance practice, would ever become a serious reality. Until 2004. when Shakespeare's Globe approached me and asked me whether I would be interested in collaborating with them on an original pronunciation performance of Romeo and Juliet. Now, the reason why they were interested was because Shakespeare's Globe on the South Bank, as many of you will know, was set up 10 years ago, a little more, 1997, to introduce, as far as it is possible, original practices from Shakespeare's time. So the Globe itself is a reconstruction, as far as anybody can establish, of the shape of the theatre physically. Over the first 10 years, 8, 9 years, they introduced original practices in all sorts of domains. Original music on original instruments, original costumes, original movement around the stage, because as you may know, there are these two big pillars at the front and you can be hidden from the audience, so the actors are trained to move around the stage to make sure they're always in vision to some of the audience. Original everything, in other words, but not original pronunciation. And in 2004, they changed their mind. When I met the director, Tim Carroll, and said, "Why have you changed your mind?" he said, "Well, it's very simple. If we don't do it, Stratford will." And there is this great enmity, you see, this great envy between the Shakespeare's Globe on the South Bank and the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford-upon-Avon. So I said, "Why wasn't it done before?" And he said, "Because everybody was scared of it. Because there is a view about that if we produced plays in Shakespearean pronunciation, they would be unintelligible. Because the language has changed so much in the last 400 years," he went on. "And nobody wants unintelligibility at Shakespeare's Globe because the theatre is only open for 6 months of the year. It is an open-air theatre. It had its last performance last weekend. It's closed now till next May. And they have to have bums on seats all the time. And the thought that you might put on a production which nobody would understand meant that they were scared of the audience just walking out." So I said to him, "Have you ever heard Shakespearean pronunciation?" And he said, "No, nor had anybody else. Could I give him some, please?" So immediately all those bits of brain that come from reading Dobson Once Upon a Time and Kerkeritz and all of those things, I suddenly had to put into some sort of practical application. Moving fast forward ahead, having done the relevant revision, as I suppose you might call it, or research, to top up those batteries, I was able to give him something which, of course, was not unintelligible at all. The version that I used with the Globe, and still use with them because they've done other productions since, goes something like this. Instead of the opening of, let's say, the opening of Henry V, the chorus speech, which, of course, ought to be, "Oh, for a muse afar that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention, a kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, assume the port of Mars, and at his heels, leashed in like hounds, would famine, sword, and fire crouch for employment." Thank you, Sir John. Now, that is how it's normally done. But of course, in Shakespeare's time, it would have been something like this. "Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention, a kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, assume the port of Mars, and at his heels, leashed in like hounds, would famine, sword, and fire crouch for employment." Now, whatever the ins and outs of that, oh my, you're sounding like a Globe audience now. Well, the point is that the audience did applaud that production of Romeo and Juliet in extremely warm and effusive terms, and also the next year when we did Troilus and Cressida there in OP. And the reason was because, of course, they understood it, as you did. Even if we could debate as indeed there are already historical phonologists around this room saying to themselves, now Crystal's front vowel there was probably not quite, I don't think it would have been so much sin, but perhaps sen, or maybe it might be sin. Yes, let's debate this. And I noticed he dropped his H's all the time. Now, is this actually the case? Did H dropping, was he? And you know, there are people now thinking along these lines. Fine, that's exactly the point. Yeah? I would go round in the interval to everybody and ask them how they were finding the play. And they all said they, first of all, understood it and they were enjoying it and having a great time. And then they all said, without exception, whoever I asked, of course, we speak like that back where we live. So people from the West Country would say, oh, we speak like that where we come from, yes. And then people from Ireland were saying, sure, we speak like that in Ireland as well. And I met this guy from Virginia who said, we speak like that in Virginia. And so we're getting, everybody was owning the accent. There were a group of teenage inner city kids in the corner, and I go over to them and I say, how are you finding this, lads? And they say, oh, it's great, innit? And I say, what's great about it? And they say, well, because it's all original, innit? And I say, how do you know that? Our teacher told us, innit? And he said, so I say, what's impressed you so much about it? And this one kid turned to me and he says, well, normally, he says, you go to theatre and it's all posh, innit? But it's not here. Yeah, they don't talk posh here. They talk like us. Now, there's nothing in my version of OP, was there, that sounds like that kind of Cockney. They weren't talking like us, but the kid thought they were. So there was obviously an accent here that is reaching out to the kids in a way that other accents do not. And I think this deserves a great deal of study to see how certain accents elicit a kind of resonance with your own accent background. Some work has been done on this in modern English, but I don't know of anything that's been done in early modern English. The internet is one of our biggest challenges, I think, as linguists generally, and as English linguists in particular. The challenge is there because, well, first and foremost, the difficulty of getting the data. I'm not talking about the web, that's easy to get hold of. No, I'm talking about the range of internet functions where it's simply damn difficult to get the data. You can't just go into a chat room and download the stuff. They don't like it. They don't want you to be there. They don't like linguists lurking around in chat rooms. They want you out of there, and they tell you so. So how do you get chat room data? How do you get blog data? What sort of permission range do you need to have? Whose copyright is it anyway? And all of that sort of thing. When I was doing my book on text messaging recently, I had terrible trouble getting examples of texts from everybody. I would go up to somebody and I would say, can I have your texts? And they would say, no. They're mine, you can't have them. It's a cheek asking, you know. I would ask my kids and they would say, yeah, but give me a minute, Dad. And then you'd get a sort of sanitized set of texts coming through. Lucy living in Amsterdam and drugs aren't mentioned even once, you know. I mean, come on, yeah. So, difficulty of getting reliable data and uncertainties about the permission is a big problem for many areas of the internet. Which is a shame, because here we're dealing with the largest historical corpus ever. Remember that everything on the internet is time-stamped. Maybe not on the surface, on the screen, but in the data behind the screen, you will find a time reference. So now we can do extraordinary studies, not just this word seems to have arrived in English somewhere between 1660 and 1820. No. We can now say this word is used for the first time in English on the 11th of November 2004 at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Now that gives us an entirely different perspective on historical language studies, it seems to me. Internet security. This is, I suppose, linking up with forensic linguistics generally, trying to identify problems of fraud, terrorism, aberrant sexual activity, and so on the web, or in chat rooms, children's chat rooms in particular. A few years ago, I was asked the question, can you spot a paedophile in a chat room? And the answer, I thought, after a little while was, yes, I think I can. But in order to establish that, you have to do an awful lot of analysis of real paedophile conversations. Now, this is not easy, because as soon as you try and download paedophile, you see the problem. You see the problem. You've got to be careful here. You have to check in with the police first, who look at you very suspiciously. They say, "Why do you want to do this?" And you say, "I'm an applied linguist." And they say, "Oh yeah, a cunning linguist, I suppose." And they make jokes like this, and you get very embarrassed, and so on and so forth. Eventually you can get coverage. You've got to go to the Home Office before you can get, in Britain at any rate, before you can get permission to even do this kind of research. And even then it's dangerous. I know a guy who was doing a PhD on paedophile activity up in the north, in central Lancashire. And he was investigated by the police several times. It had all been okayed with the university, so it was all right. But when the thesis was finished and they had to send it to the external examiner, the university was told by the police that if they sent it through the post, they would be breaking the law. Because this is sending perverse material through the post, and this is not allowed. So the guy had to take the flipping thesis by hand to the external examiner in order to get it done. So people are naturally very sensitive about this. It's extremely difficult research to do, but it needs to be done, because it can be done. Pedophiles are stupid. They use very simple, they think sophisticated strategies for trying to elicit interest from a young girl or boy. And, you know, what are you wearing? I mean, for heaven's sake. And so it doesn't take much of a linguistic intellect to work out what the strategies of interaction are. But it does take a linguistic intellect, and that's the point. New angles are coming up all the time. The domains of childhood, Dylan Thomas once said, have no order and no end. The domains of applied English linguistics have no order and no end either. Isle, it seems to me, is a perfect place to provide some order, but not, I suspect, any end. Thank you very much.
Now, very briefly, a look at Promontory 3. Globalization, spread of English. That map there from David Crystal, 1995, is old, but it tells us something important. It tells us that there are basically two types of English, we all know that. It tells us that the spread of English is not only based on colonialization patterns. You see with the languages where, the parts of the world where English as a second language or as a variety of English is spoken tends to correlate with colonialization patterns. But you will also notice that there's a strong correlation with trade routes. Now, the study of the globalization of English, as far as I see it, started out with studies of pidgins and creoles, thinking here of the work of Bickerton and Rickford, the look at varieties of English that developed in particular historical circumstances. And since then, there's been a turn to study of second language varieties and national Englishes around the world, represented by the Kortmann and Schneider 2004, now paperback 2008 volumes, the comparative cross-dialectal and cross-linguistic point of view. And to think of special theoretical interest here is what is the effect of contact, both linguistic and social contact. And another theoretical question that many people are puzzling over is the paradox of the fact that English is morphologically fairly simple, but so idiomatic that it is very context dependent and enormously complex. And if you think of look up, look down on, look over, overlook, you can add to those endlessly, right? Just the use of these little particles and prepositions and how they work, which is enormously complicated for non-native speakers of English to understand. So the English may look morphologically awfully simple, but it is very complex at another level. So what is complexity? That, I think, is a major theme that a lot of people here and elsewhere are thinking about. I know there's or has been, a workshop on Anglo-versals, which has been a project at Freiburg. Those are special universals that seem to arise independent of various historical and other contexts in which one might imagine that they occurred. Or the vernacular versals, universals. Well, that's a new term, right? There's also, of course, been enormous interest in the fact that for the first time we have a globalization process that is happening in real time. Spanish and Portuguese were widely spread languages many centuries ago, but of course we have no direct access to them, nor do we have direct access to globalization of Latin, Sanskrit, and various other languages. So is there something special about English? Is there something special about English that is actually, in its spread, making the Crystal 1995 Matt outdated? He's here, so he can answer that question. Probably is going to talk about it. But I think there is a question when we think about the fact that English is now spread by the media, internet, the global economy, for better or for worse, very worse in the last few weeks, global travel, and the various other kinds of global phenomena that are leading, have led to the spread of English. Not that English is necessarily very well known by the speakers who use it, but nevertheless, as David Crystal said in the 2006 article that I refer to here, about 25% of the population of the world apparently has some access, at least minimal access, to some kind of probably quite limited English, limited not only in the extent of the amount of English that's available, but limited to the actual text type in which it is used. So he has raised the question for us to think about. Does this suggest, because of the unprecedented media, global economy, global travel, that we have different globalization patterns from those that we've had before? One thing I think we can be fairly sure of that is not going to be different is that geopolitical shifts may bring radical changes, sometimes in a big hurry. I was very interested last year when I went to Brazil to see the Museum of the Portuguese Languages in São Paulo. Fascinating museum, interactive. Talks about not only Brazilian Portuguese, but all the languages that contribute to the linguistic world of Brazil. And it turns out there's an English project supposed to come to fruition in 2012 in Winchester, England. And I've asked Bass Arts to be in touch with them, and he sent me this. You can see it on the website. This project will include all forms of English to reflect the amazing variety and power and adaptability of the language, from the street and workplace to science and advertising. There will be a core exhibition tracking the broad development of the language over the past 1,500 years across the globe, but it will be supplemented constantly by temporary exhibitions focused on special aspects and applications of English in, for example, pop music and science, law and love. Now, again, I think it's not our responsibility to run such a museum, but I do think that as linguists and as members of IEL, we have some responsibility to interact with them if we can, and to suggest ways in which they can make this particular project even more valuable than it might otherwise be. I want to end on a closing note. I've changed my metaphor from promontory to building the Tower of Babel. Babel, whichever you prefer. There was, as most of you probably know, a monk called Alfred who did a lot of work around the year 1000. And he wrote one of the first grammars of English, which, given one of my themes today, is interestingly a comparison with Latin. Okay. So we have a very long history of comparative work. And I found online this really rather beautiful, I think, picture of the building of the Tower of Babel. I don't know, it doesn't come across very well in the color. It looks beautiful here on the computer. Not so beautiful there. But if you can decode it, this is building the tower. This is building it. There's nothing about the dissolution of languages. This is not the Tower of Babel that's falling apart and dissolving. And it struck me that we might think of this as what we're doing here at IEL. We're building languages and varieties of languages, thinking about how they coexist. Because of the comparative work that is being done, this will make us understand similarities and differences between English and other languages of the world better, and the similarities and differences among the varieties of English that exist. And so will matching micro to macro analysis and understanding how the small individual bricks make up the whole. So I wish us all well in our tower building. Thank you.
I also would like to say something about the Tower of Babel. I thought rebuilding it might be a rather hubris kind of thing. And so I thought it might be a good idea to build a tower with a very broad base and not too high and not too airy. And so in this tower I would like to make a plea for analogy, because I think analogy has a very broad base, because it's an important principle, not just in language, but in many other cognitive areas. Now, analogies can be very concrete or quite abstract. That is, an analogy may be based on both concrete lexical items as well as more abstract schemas. Important is also that analogy is a very fluid concept and therefore works quite differently from the type of global rules which are favored by generative or formal linguists. Hofstetter, 1995, gives a wonderful example of analogical thinking and the fluidity of it on a very concrete level of language use. This is under one on the handout. He describes analogy there as conceptual slippage and argues that this slippage is important in order to keep language workable and flexible. And it is to be preferred, he says, to a rigid system. So I'll read out the example, his own example. One last example from this genre, perhaps my favorite one. A grocery store checkout clerk asked me, "Plastic bag all right?" To which I replied, "Prefer a wood one, a paper one, please." Contributing towards this slip might have been the following factors. Paper is made of wood pulp. Grocery bags are brownish, somewhat like wood, and unlike standard paper, at least in the United States, not at all in where I come from. They are also considerably woodier in texture than ordinary paper is. And plastic and wood are both common materials out of which many household items are made, whereas paper is not. Substitution errors like this reveal aspects of the subterranean landscape, the hidden network of overlapping, blurred together concepts. They show us that under many circumstances we confuse one concept with another, and this helps give a picture of what's going on when we make an analogy between different situations. The same properties of our conceptual networks as are responsible for our proneness to these conceptual halo slips make us willing to tolerate or forgive a certain degree of conceptual mismatch between situations, depending on the context. We are congenitally constructed to do so. It's good for us, evolutionary speaking. My term, conceptual slippage, is in fact no more and no less than a shorthand for this notion of context-dependent tolerance of conceptual mismatch. Analogical rules typically do not work across the board, but in local areas. And analogical learning starts with concrete situations and is based on experience, both linguistic and situational. Just like the kind of analogical reasoning that we saw in Hofstadter's example, which also depends on a situation and on previous experiences. When a child sees a banana, then it also, when it sees another banana, even though that banana may not be exactly the same, it sees that that is similar, and therefore it learns, after seeing a few bananas, it learns that there is something like a banana type. I must say, now that I read the word banana, I keep thinking of Mestri's talk, and I shouldn't have used apple, I should have used coconut and lychee, I suppose. And it's interesting that those three too, of course, form a set, just like apple and banana here form a set. Okay, what they also learn when they see a banana, that it is good food to eat when you're hungry. And this is the indexical relation, the function of banana, if you like. So when they then see an apple and they know that an apple is also good to eat, they begin to see an iconic relation even between apple and banana on a higher level. Not, of course, on the visual level, but on the functional level. They also begin to learn that there are other types of fruit, so they begin to learn there is a set of fruit, and that all these fruits are countable. So they learn something like count nouns on an even higher abstract level, and then of course they learn something about nouns on an even higher abstract level. At the same time, because they're confronted with conventional language, they learn about abstract indexical relations. So they learn that these words are often preceded in English by a determiner. So they learn something like determiner noun order, and so on and so forth. Now, in symbolic thinking, to recognize any pattern without it being concretely represented, symbolic thinking then is to recognize any pattern without it being concretely represented, to know what banana stands for without actually seeing one, to have knowledge of the pragmatic, semantic and formal relations between banana and other linguistic signs on different levels. This later symbolic stage is what Holyoake and Thaggart 1995 have called system mapping. And they note it's only found in humans. For instance, they write that humans can see a similarity between a sample representing two trees and a sample representing two frogs, as in figure 3.1, even though the frog and the tree are not icons of one another. The iconic pattern that they in fact discern is the isomorphism of the combination of two of the same things. Humans then would not see an analogy between a sample representing two trees and another one presenting a frog and an apple, because here the higher order pattern, two of the same, does not apply. Now, non-human primates are not able to see the higher, more abstract analogy without extensive training, which crucially involved language training, according to Holyoake and Thaggart. And they write that children begin to understand this mapping from the age of about 3 onwards, and would be able to solve the above analogy without help by about age 4. In other words, humans are able to perceive analogies between linguistic signs on a purely intralinguistic or symbolic level, as well as more concrete ones between signs. Hence, the form of signs can be motivated by other abstract forms.
My talk, as I've said, is a continuation of a talk I gave last year. It's the Sociophonetics of English in Post-Apartheid South Africa. For me, it marks a slight departure from my traditional research on language contact, and this time I'm kind of following what young people are doing, and it seems to me that sociophonetics is an exciting part of global English studies. South Africa is a country that has undergone tremendous changes since the 1990s, and it's a time when the world was changing globally. If you think of Eastern Europe, Russia, other places as well, a time of tremendous social change, new democracies coming to being with lots of new problems too, and one can choose to study the problems. And I have sort of worked on some of those aspects, although not as fervently as colleagues in applied linguistics. And there's a sense in which if the world has to be changed, then I'm counting on the applied linguists to do that. I want to chart out one of the success stories of post-apartheid South Africa, namely the kind of transition from a deeply divided racial society prior to the 1980s to a society in which there is a tremendous sense of new things happening and young people coming together. This is certainly one of the success stories, the kind of expansion of the educated middle classes in South Africa and the sense of non-racial social networks and friendship and love relations across color lines. Really, this is not just a particular case study of a particular country and its own kind of racial skewing and peculiarities. In a way, South Africa affords us a kind of laboratory conditions for studying what happens when social networks are first constrained enormously to the extent that it determined where you were born, which hospital segregated, where you lived, which school you went to, all segregated, what kind of work you did, not in many cases where you worked, but not always. And it did constrain the kind of relations between employer and employee as well. And finally, it followed you to the grave, the segregated cemetery. The whole idea of apartheid South Africa was to constrain the social movements of black people, fit them with enough rudiments of education to succeed in labor situations and nothing else. Nevertheless, some professionals, like a few doctors, a few lawyers, and so forth, and some business people, did succeed and become enormously rich, but were stifled by apartheid in that they couldn't move out of a black area and couldn't invest and couldn't send their children to the best schools, etc. That started to crumble even before apartheid officially ended. So come 1994, already there was a small segment of the black population and of Indians and coloreds who were materially somewhat better off than black people to enter those private schools. However, with whites being in a majority in those schools, they became the reference group. So for my study, the kind of reference group in terms of social status, prestige, friendship as well, because this is a success story. The hundreds of interviews we've been doing in Cape Town show that at schools, especially primary schools, there were no serious problems across racial groups, certainly not in the private schools. In some Model C schools, it was mostly fine, except the boys of different racial groups occasionally would beat each other up, they said quite easily, and apparently that is the norm, as boys will be boys, etc. Now, 10 years down the line, people suddenly woke up to the enormous change that had happened and what I call a silent linguistic revolution. Inadvertently, those parents who had sent their children to the best schools were dismayed to find that their children had changed completely after 10 years in terms of behavior, posture, gesture, culture, attitude to a whole lot of things held dear in conservative traditional societies like gender relations, marriage, and so on, customary practices, rituals, and so on. So to the extent that politicians, you would think, would have much better things to do and more important things to do, had debates and brought out a report expressing their grave concern about the way young people had changed and were, quote unquote, losing their culture. Often allied to this concern of losing culture is the fear expressed of children losing their language. Now, when you deal with South Africa, you must recognize that English is the home language of a very small segment of the country, perhaps 15%, but growing. Okay, so African languages are alive and well, and much more so with the working classes and lower middle classes, but there are now, for the first time, some black families who have moved into the former white suburbs and who are outnumbered there, but also whose education and lifestyles are changing and who are starting to speak less and less of their traditional languages like Zulu or Xhosa, etc. You all know that crossing was Ben Rampton's term for the playful, almost flirtatious use of a language by a dominant group of youngsters starting to use a language they were not expected to know and didn't know very well. And so crossing is a way of young people playing with ethnic boundaries, playing with language, and really contesting some of the established mores of the previous generation. Crossing in the old South Africa was not possible. It would purely be lampoon and parody. And even in the new South Africa, crossing, I did not find much evidence of crossing in the first 10 years, because I think race relations were still far too sensitive an issue to be experimenting playfully with and with using in a slightly mocking way. Instead, what I'm going to record are crossovers. So the young people I'm going to be looking at are not crossing into a variety. They have moved into it, have adopted it, have appropriated it, if you like. And so I talk of crossover lifestyles and accents, which is what's going on. Okay, a part of this is the phenomenon called coconut in South Africa. Now, for those of you at Drakensberg last year, rest assured I won't go into the details. There I talked for at length, about 15 minutes, on this wonderful novel written by a young medical student at my university, Kopana Matlwa, who still speaks Tswana. And it's a wonderful novel about identity change. A young person brought up in the kind of situation I was describing to you, who has lost the ability to speak Tswana and whose friendship circles was entirely white and who saw the world as white and didn't know this until it was pointed out to her by her brother that all the pictures of the pop stars and film stars were entirely white on a wall and her friends were all white and she spoke and behaved white. And she then tries to resurrect something of her traditional background. She tries to learn Tswana. She thinks she succeeds, but it seems to me as a linguist she's failed because she learns lists of words and nothing else. Coconut is a term that encapsulates what's going on in South Africa and the kind of different positions regarding identity change and so forth. Coconuts are people who do not behave in the way traditionally expected of them. Quote unquote, these are people who are dark on the outside, white on the inside. Okay? And this term is very well known in middle-class South Africa. It's hardly known in working-class societies that I worked with. When I ask someone, what's a coconut? One of many questions one asks. And they say, oh, it's an edible fruit, isn't it? And then you know other meaning. And this tells you something about the class chasm. So what I'm saying is not typical of the country. It's one segment and one thing that I think is both interesting and promising that's going on. But it's true to say that people in the townships, the large majority of poor, disadvantaged, and unemployed and underemployed people don't share the kind of concerns about identity and fashion and status and so on. And being a coconut is a complex thing. Usually, people see others as coconuts. So we've had students on campus who report this, that they saw these very fancy black youngsters, and black can also mean Indian and colored, from private schools who speak and behave totally differently from what the prototype of a black person was, and they call them coconuts. But after studying for the year at university, these very same students who do the labeling go back home to their traditional areas, and hey presto, they've changed subtly without realizing it, and all their former friends in the villages, rural areas, and even townships label them coconuts. So it's a very interesting phenomenon. The only people who don't object to coconut and who laugh about it and who think it's a bit of a lark are not just the new middle classes, but I would submit the solidly upper middle class. And I would say those who are insecure about the label and take major objection to being labeled a coconut would, in my terms, correlate with being lower middle class. And the upper middle class are above it all. They just see it as just another term out there, and they probably recognize that their behavior has gone way beyond reacting to reproaches. Coconut is a term that I've been accused just once or twice to say, why are you using these derogatory terms, and shouldn't you know better, and so on. I said, well, we'd rather discuss things openly than sort of suppress things. We've had enough of suppression and banning of terms and things. More so, it's not the sociolinguists who've invented the term. Young people are the ones who've come up with the term. And it does mean something. It's equivalent of the Oreo biscuit in the United States, etc. And more so, people are using this as a way of actually coming to terms with former disparities and, what physiological and physical differences really mean and what should they mean, etc. And the young people I've interviewed in their home settings, not in a kind of formal situation, really have fun with terms like this. And there are a number of terms out there. Oreo is also starting to be known in South Africa. Banana is one terrible term that I've heard, and I've seen it on a website in Britain as well, for Chinese community. Yellow on the outside, etc. This can continue. But in South Africa, kids are playing with terms like this. And I came across the term for white people, coined by Indians and coloreds, a lychee. And I said, well, I don't see what this has to do with it. I said, lychee, easy, white on the outside, dark on the inside for their best friends, who are quite happy to be friends with black people. White on the outside, dark on the inside, turns red in the sun.
Starting first with my key question, how, meaning for a variationist or a good quantitative sociolinguist, how often and with what linguistic conditioning or constraints do Creole and vernacular English speakers in Guyana, Jamaica, Appalachia, and African America, a term I like, omit that, who, what, in relative clauses like I saw the boy, that, who, what, you like. So my interest is in the zero variant, often referred to these days as relativizer omission. Now, from quantitative studies of the last 10 to 20 years, we know a lot about this variable in various British and American varieties. Not as many vernacular varieties as we'd like, but still quite a few. But really nothing, nada, zilch about this in Caribbean Creole English or any of the other varieties that I just mentioned. So that's why I wanted to talk about that today. But in looking at this phenomena, we are led to a second larger question. Can the patterns of relativizer omission in these vernacular varieties contribute any new insights to the old debate about the Creole versus English origins of African American vernacular English? Now, for instance, if the black African American vernacular English patterns, like Caribbean Creole English is, that is, if Av looks like Caribbean Creole English is in relativizer omission, speakers of Caribbean English were well represented in the founding populations of black English speakers in the American colonies, while the white Appalachian speakers behave more like English speakers in Ulster and other northern British areas from which the ancestors of today's Appalachians came, we might conclude that the Creolists are right. And I said here, hooray, For America, I would say woohoo, but I wasn't sure you would understand that. And we might say more generally that this case confirms Lebov's more general claim that quantitative patterns can apparently preserve linguistic history over several centuries and several continents. But this brings me then to my third question, which I call the mother of all questions, at least the mother of all my questions for today, which is whether the variable patterns for relativizer omission are specific enough to particular dialects or regions that we can use them reliably to reconstruct historical relations from these cross-variety comparisons, or whether they in fact begin to reflect broader processing constraints that might be found in all Englishes, if not universally. Now, so, I mean, why do we care about relativizer omission, and why is it relevant to the debate about the Creole origins of African-American vernacular English? And I think that's because primarily, over the past decade, relativizer omission has been added to the evidence of copular absence and other variables in the debate over the Creole origins of Av. So this was particularly done by Totti and Ray, 1997, and Totti and Harvey, 2000. And those of us who've labored long in the copular, I don't want to say graveyard, but, pardon? Trenches, right. So delighted to see something else. We said, this looks nice and new. We got to get into this. And it's also a syntactic variable, which in general, variationist studies tend to do less often, at least tend to have done less often in the past than morphological and phonological variants. So here's some non-subject examples from Jamaica. There's nothing a woman can do which a man can do. Now, I'm not here to argue the content of this sentence. I don't share the same opinion. I wouldn't be able to go home tonight if I said this. But Jack, who's a Jamaican farmer, said this in an interview that Angela and I did some years ago. So obviously we have a zero form. It's a non-subject. Relativizer is existential sentence. There's nothing. It's long. Using the criterion that Tagliamonte et al. Established, about 3 words, greater than 3 words is long. I think we have a sense that we want to go back and revisit this because there's so many dimensions of length that seem to get left out, but has an indefinite pronoun antecedent. The relativizer is adjacent to the noun phrase, it's right next to it, has a non-human antecedent, and is singular. And then we pick up the other relativizer there, same thing, there's nothing a woman can do, which a man can do, right? And here it's non-subject again. In this case, the relativizer, which is of course no longer adjacent to its head, nothing, because it's separated by that other relative clause. Basically, the more predictable a relative clause is, non-subject relative clause, the less likely it is to begin with that, okay? So I think about, I guess the analogy would be like, the way, I guess the analogy I was trying to think of was peacocks or something in mating season, who try to pan out their feathers and say, look at me, I'm a peacock, right? So we might think of relative clauses as needing to do something like this when they're less expected. They say, make a big fuss. Here's my that, here's my who, here's my whom. Look out, you're going to see me. But if I'm very, very much expected in this environment, then they don't need to do this. So the more likely that a relative clause, a noun phrase with certain characteristics is going to be followed by a relative clause, then the less likely you are to need a relativizer like that, or any of the other forms to mark the beginning of that clause. At present, we can't fully test this with our data because it means not only looking at every noun phrase with a relative clause, but looking at every noun phrase in the corpus, period, okay? This has already taken us long enough. We can't look at every single noun phrase, right? So what we need to be able to do is have our data in a form where we can just plug the whole thing in, have a computer go in and have a parsed corpus, have a computer go in and pull out all the noun phrases, look at how often we get relative clauses, and then look at how often we get zero, okay? But even though there are challenges involved in trying to get to a means of testing this kind of hypothesis, I personally feel that the prospects for work along these lines are exciting, even if, or perhaps because, they take us beyond these sectarian squabbles about the origins of African vernacular English and other varieties. Not to have you think I've gotten completely old and soft. I still like squabbles. Some of my colleagues here will remember that a couple of years ago, I went to a conference and said I came to wage war, not peace. But after several more years of Bush, I guess I've changed my mind, and I'm going to join the peace movement, and Obama is rising, and so on and so forth. So I said here, wouldn't it be great if we could join forces and use the study of English creoles and vernaculars to learn more about language and what it's like to be humans.
My case study is based on the community of Fiji Indians in Wellington, New Zealand. But why do I think that the Indian diaspora in general is an interesting research topic that deserves more attention? One reason is its ubiquity. More than 20 million Indians do not live in India, either as people of Indian origin, PIOs, or non-resident Indians, NRIs. And the PIOs and the NRIs can be found on every continent, virtually, if you look. The Indian diaspora is a global phenomenon. And the Encyclopedia of the World's Minorities points out that, and you find the quotation here, members of this diasporic population typically view themselves as ethnic others in their countries of settlement, reworking traditional forms of social custom, religious engagement, popular culture, and linguistic affiliation through collective interaction with their host societies. But these host societies are beginning to pay more attention to the Indian diaspora too. I can think of at least two factors that are likely to have contributed to a growing awareness of the local Indian population in the general public. One is the more recent wave of migration on a global scale in the wake of the electronic revolution. And the other is an interest in Indian popular culture which I here refer to as the Bollywood phenomenon. There's even a musical that's simply called Bollywood, the show, that has attracted over 300,000 visitors in Europe alone. Bombay Boogie Nights must be an extremely popular pastime of a lot of Germans and Swiss. And a Google search for these kind of dance events on German and Swiss web pages alone produced well over 50,000 hits. So these are some of the ads that you get there. There's also a growing interest in the Indian migrant community in New Zealand. More or less simultaneously with my arrival in Wellington last year, what might be called a coffee table book about Indian settlers in New Zealand was published. It's based on the author's PhD thesis. It was released for the Diwali festival in November, and Diwali celebrations themselves are another cultural phenomenon that increasingly attracts non-Indians in the countries where they're being celebrated. Lecky's book looks at the history of Indian settlers that arrived directly from India, a migration movement that goes back to the colonial days. I will be looking at much more recent arrivals, but the different levels of migration directly from India, from Indian diasporic communities, different temporal or diachronic layers of migration add some spice to the topic, as you will see. As far as scholarly treatments of the Indian diaspora in general are concerned, literary works have received incredibly wide recognition. We just have to think of authors such as Salman Rushdie or V.S. Naipaul, for instance. Probably less well-known is Jacob Rajan, a New Zealand Indian, whose play about a corner dairy was a great success at the 1999 Edinburgh Fringe Theatre Festival. The Indian diaspora has been looked at by historians, sociologists, psychologists, anthropologists, and even economists. Surprisingly, however, the linguistics of the Indian diaspora has so far been given relatively little attention. A lot of the previous research focuses on the development of Indian languages in the diaspora situations, for instance, Spartz and Siegel, or the work by Mugla and colleagues, to name a few. Studies on the sociolinguistics of the Indian diaspora are often difficult to access because some of these studies were never published. Gambia and Shamim, for instance. One major exception is the Indian diaspora in South Africa. Mestry's work is also exceptional because it does not only focus on Bhojpuri Hindi, that's his 1991 book, and sociolinguistic aspects of language contact, but he also describes the local contact variety of Indian English. And as we saw in the first plenary, and this is where we're coming full circle in a way, the ongoing developments in this variety. What about attitudes towards English? Most of the people I interviewed were aware of the fact that Indians from Fiji speak a different kind of English from New Zealanders, obviously. The main difference in their eyes would normally be the accent. One woman recalled how she was being ridiculed about her accent at school when she first came to New Zealand. What I remember that stands out a lot, when I was 10, a lot of kids would ask me to count to 10, and so I would count to 10, and every time I'd get up to the number 6, they would crack up laughing, and I was sitting and going, what am I saying wrong, you know? I'm trying to, and it was only like a few years later, I actually clicked. I wasn't saying 6, but I was saying 6, which means something else in the New Zealand context. Another informant was aware of a pecking order of different ethnic varieties of English within the New Zealand context. He said there's a greater acceptance by so-called Kiwis of languages from France or other countries, and if somebody speaks English with a French accent, then that's quaint. Whereas Fiji, English with a Sikh accent or Indian accent, then that's just Sikh or Indian accent. 2 women in their 20s who arrived in New Zealand as young children talk about consciously adjusting their way of speaking English to the local New Zealand variety and the motivation for it. Yeah, so when I heard people like teasing me and speaking like I was, you tried to correct it. We corrected that very fast. And that's why we sound so much like Kiwis now, because we've learned how. Another informant who migrated to New Zealand in her early 20s is quite comfortable with her accent, however. I haven't got a Kiwi accent. A lot of people have commented on it, even married to a New Zealander. You haven't got an accent, so why should I have a Kiwi accent? You know, I'm happy with what I am. I'm unique. Everybody's unique. So she is aware of having a Fiji Indian accent and quite comfortable with it. My brief conclusion would be my data clearly show that the second generation Fiji Indians, while having varying degrees of proficiency in Fiji Hindi and Standard Hindi, have adapted very well to the New Zealand context in their use of English. There is even some adaptation that can be observed in the speech of the first immigrants, for instance, with respect to HRTs and some New Zealand vowels, in the speech of those who migrated in their late teens. And this adaptability is a characteristic of the Indian diaspora that has been pointed out elsewhere. India exported her unique methods of adapting to linguistic diversity with her migrants. Wherever they went, Indian migrants proved to be linguistically adaptable in ways that British or French or Chinese migrants were not. If anything, the fact of dispersal speeded up the process of linguistic flux endemic to the subcontinent. And this is end. Thank you very much.